The on-location battlefield scenes were funded in part by Coldwater American Legion Post Number 52, the Kiwanis Club of Coldwater, and Plant Moran CPA of Coldwater.
When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer, the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home.
Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself cannot stand. Matthew 12:25.
Welcome to our program. We'll recount the adventures of the men who manned this cannon during the war between the states. We shall follow the men, most of whom came from Branch County as they left home in 1861. The program will follow their campaigns, complete with the humor and the terror as they lived it. In American history, no other topic has had so much written about it as the Civil War, or the War of Southern Independence, if you come from the South. Virtually every paragraph written on the subject is open to wide debate. We're not trying to pass off our program as anything undeniable. Healthy debate keeps history alive. Also in the short span of this program, no one can hope to cover the local history in its entirety. Certainly, some will note things left out or points not covered. Our goal here is not to elaborate on the litanies or genealogies of the families involved. What we will try to do is conjure up the visions these men saw as they went to war. What was in their hearts? Who were their leaders? What journeys did they make before their duty was done? We are more concerned with their campaigns than their lives in Branch County. First, we have to go back to the year the war began, 1861. The year is of special interest for Coldwater because as can be learned on this state historical marker, it was the year the village became a city. Within 2 months of that important date, the young men from this newly incorporated municipality would volunteer for service in the most terrible war in our country's history.
Coldwater in 1861 was a small town. People differ in their assumptions as to what business brought in all the money which built the beautiful homes. Some say horses and horse racing were major reasons. Others say it was the cigar manufacturing trade.
Or the fact that for just more than a decade, the railroad ran through the community, making Coldwater a central link between Chicago and Detroit. Some say it was nothing more than the general expanding businesses of a young, growing city. However, it is certain the major business in Branch County, and probably the business which was most fruitful, was agriculture. There were many large palatial farms in the area, and from the artists' renderings of the days, it is easy to see the farms were prosperous.
At any rate, the area was much the same as any in the North at that time, and like any other community across the continent, Branch County citizens were keeping an open eye on the developing political fortunes. Only a matter of weeks before, Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as the 16th president. The reasonably new Republican Party had gained amazing strength in less than a decade, and the basic philosophies of that party were well known. Southerners knew their peculiar institution of slavery was at risk. The abolitionists had taken to the new party, and the Senate and House in Washington were filling with radical Republicans, whose main ambition was the extermination of slavery. What were the political feelings in Branch County? More than likely, they centered on agriculture and protected trade. As for the slavery issue, probably most were against it. Indeed, Coldwater lay along two basic lines of the Underground Railroad, one from St. Joseph to Detroit, the other, the Quaker line, from Cincinnati up to Adrian. There are several tales that homes in Coldwater actually had secret rooms or passages in them to nurture and hide runaway slaves. There is no primary source truth to give evidence to this.
This is the home of John G. Parkhurst on Clay Street. He was a successful local attorney, a colonel during the war, and a brevet, or temporary general, after the conflict. He went on to government service for many years. After the battery had many of its leading officers resign in Detroit, he was offered command of the group. Parkhurst was going to accept the commission, but the illness of his wife Amelia kept him home. After she died, he went on to glory and some embarrassment with the 9th Michigan Infantry. The reason we're here outside his home is because it is one of the houses alleged to have been a haven for runaway slaves. Caleb B. Peckham, also of Coldwater, and John D. Zimmerman of Union City were also believed to have been citizens who lent their homes to the cause. But there is no real documentation of a primary sort to verify the gossip. Indeed, slaves leaving the South were told to follow the Northern Star in their night travels to safety. Ives Miles of Coldwater had a star on the front of his home, which was a popular decorative motif in those days. Legend has it the star was displayed to notify slaves it was a house of refuge in the Underground Railroad. Of course, this is nonsense. The star was on the house before the railroad began, plus the mainstay of the Underground Railroad was secrecy. No one would have so boldly advertised their home as a sanctuary for runaway slaves.
Besides, runaway slaves did not mill about looking for stars on houses. Someone showed them the way.
These are the usual twice-told tales, which, passed along from generation to generation, get twisted out of shape. But the point is, Coldwater was located at the crossroads of two underground lines. Slaves certainly came through the area, and due to the travel conditions of the times, someone gave them food and rest before sending them along. It is almost certain people in Coldwater helped the slaves. There is just no documentation as to who it was. To advance the argument in favor of Branch County's abolition involvement, Former slave Sojourner Truth came to Coldwater to speak. Laura Smith Haviland, who ran a home for indigent children to learn and work, lived and worked in the area.
Slave owners from the South called her home a nigger's den and put a $3,000 reward on her head. Abolitionists called her the superintendent of the Underground Railroad. She worked for the state orphanage, the general area of the present correctional facilities. During the Civil War, she was a nurse, and afterwards her public service carried her westward. Haviland, Kansas, is named after her. It is crystal clear upon close scrutiny that Branch County, though not outwardly vociferous against slavery, did have its radical element that promoted abolition in both word and action. These activities, carried on throughout the North, did little to help ease the widening rift between the sections. But when some southern states threatened rebellion, a few northern hearts began to reach for compromise in order to save the Union. Indeed, President Lincoln had no inclination to end slavery. His professed goal was to keep slavery from spreading to the western territories, especially those gained by the U.S. victory in the Mexican War. Neither side understood the other because each chose to make the debate along institutional lines. Slavery versus non-slavery, a strong federal government versus states' rights. But the main problem was not so much institutional as it was cultural. The two sections simply did not understand each other. A farmer in Branch County could not reason why slaves were necessary. He saw it as immoral and did not like the fact slaves counted in apportionment. That is to say, several blacks equaled one white in figuring how many representatives an area could send to Congress. The Branch County farmer felt if the blacks counted in the apportionment, then they should be allowed to vote. If they could vote, then they should be free. Now, a plantation owner from the South would never be able to understand why northern people allowed themselves to become virtual wards of industrial magnates. He felt his cousins to the north had very little to say in the matters which shaped their own lives. Even though Yankees had a vote, they had very little to do with the course of their own destinies. The plantation owner could very well believe the northern workers also were slaves, but no one was trying to free them. In essence, they had given up their own freedom. This is a simplified depiction of the two sections, and indeed there were many more differences in trade tariffs, religion, relaxation, and more. By the time Lincoln was elected, very few saw any need for further attempts at compromise, and very few saw any reason for toleration.
South Carolina seceded from the Union, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. When Fort Sumter fell in Charleston Harbor, the war began. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to help stamp out the rebellion, and some states, such as powerful Virginia, saw this as a declaration of war against the new Confederate states. Virginia, followed by Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, followed suit. Rebel governments and pro-Union governments existed in the border states of Missouri and Kentucky.
War was inevitable, and the philosophical battleground was the Constitution itself. Did states have the right to divorce themselves from the Union? It was at this point that the Constitution began to eat its children. The philosophical battleground turned to realistic battlefields. The President's call for volunteer arms stirred the young men of Branch County. There had been a light artillery battery in Coldwater for some years before the war.
The Militia Act of 1808 noted each state was given an allotment of military arms and munitions according to population. By the 1850s, this act was nothing more than an old law on the books meant to help communities form militias in order to protect themselves from Indians. The leader of the Coldwater Battery was Captain Henry C. Lewis, a successful businessman who lived on a lovely estate. By 1860, his battery of 3 brass guns and 30 members was rated #1 in Michigan. We're here on Grand Street in Coldwater. In that area over there was the first local fairgrounds, owned by the Branch County Agricultural Society. It was sold soon after the war began, and new property was purchased further north and east on Marshall Street. At that location was a horse racing track, but it was at this first fairgrounds that the battery mates mustered for the war effort. They began to drill on the grounds April 24th. At that time, everyone, both north and south, expected a quick victory and felt the war would soon be over. This is one reason original enlistments were of short duration. The Coldwater Light Artillery had an initial enlistment of 3 months, which was about average in the spring of '61. On April 29th, the battery broke camp at the fairgrounds and headed south, probably down Grand to Clay Street, then through the city to the railhead. The depot at that time stood right where this one stands. It was here they boarded the train. They were 115 men strong with 3 brass guns and 52 horses. One of the beasts of burden, a former delivery horse named Sam, is one we'll hear more about later. When the train pulled out of the depot, many of the men had never been out of Branch County. Indeed, probably very few had been further than northern Indiana. The ride to Detroit would be their first long trip. They arrived in the big city on May 1st. Then the problems began to mount. First, they discovered they could not drill because the spring rains had turned the ground into a sea of mud. Also, there were problems getting munitions, leadership woes, and more than likely, a lowering of morale due to homesickness. By the time they moved along to the military installation in Detroit, Fort Wayne, 3 more guns were added to the battery.
Later that month, Captain Lewis resigned and returned to his business concerns in Coldwater. John W. Culp was elected captain, with John Youngs as senior first lieutenant and Cyrus Loomis as junior first lieutenant. Cyrus Orlando Loomis was a widowed Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania lawyer who, for some undocumented reason, quit his practice and moved to Coldwater, where his father lived. It is stated he became a salesman of industrial equipment before the war began. Of course, there is an historical debate as to whether Loomis actually lived in Coldwater before the war. Some state he joined his namesake battery after it came to Detroit.
But after this much time has passed, it's a moot question.
The fact is, by early May of 1861, he was 3rd in command. When the 1st Michigan Infantry moved out from Detroit, the Coldwater men were quite irritated they could not go with them, due to the fact there were no harnesses for the horses, the fact that there was a shortage of uniforms, and the major roadblock that they still were not officially in the U.S. Army. The battery was left behind. The harnesses arrived May 17th, and a few days later, in their new uniforms, the battery paraded through the streets of Detroit. The procession was reviewed by the governor, Austin Blair. The battery had tried to requisition powder from the Dearborn Arsenal, but since they were not official troops, the request was turned down flat. The next day, attempts were made to muster the men into the U.S. service. And thereupon hangs an interesting tale, one which would change the face of the battery before a shot was fired. About this time, Washington deemed it unnecessary to accept any further artillery volunteers, except those being accepted in the eastern states. This follows the thought of the time that the war would be over quickly and that it would be fought entirely in the east. The Coldwater battery mates were crestfallen that they could not get into the fight. Governor Blair, who had seen the battery in Detroit and who knew they were the top-rated group from Michigan, interceded for them with Washington. And others made a few attempts to get the Coldwater men into the service. And after a few delays and crisscrossing of messages, the War Department relented. But with one major condition. A mustering officer came to Fort Wayne in Detroit to muster the men into the service. He told them the government would allow them to muster, but only on the condition that their enlistment be for 3 years. Needless to say, this came as a surprise to men who thought they would be away from home for 3 months. At that point, about half the Branch County gunners, forgetting the great patriotic surge which brought them there in the first place, resigned and went home. The emergency was short-lived, for the thin ranks were soon filled with enlistments from Wayne and Oakland counties. Shortly thereafter, the battery saw its first action, but not the kind it intended. On May 25th, a number of men left the fort and went into the city without leave. After a night of drinking and general carousing, they were refused further libations at Hourigan's Saloon and were forcibly removed. Mustering reinforcements from other area taverns, the battery mates returned and created a general riot at Hourigan's. According to newspaper accounts, the battery's first campaign, the Battle of Hourigan's, ended in a draw. It must be noted the only volunteer artillery unit from the state was called the 1st Michigan Light Artillery. It was composed of 14 different companies, or batteries, and rarely did they operate together. The units were spread among the various federal armies. Of the 14 companies, 5 of them, A, D, F, G, and L, were Coldwater units. The unit which worked the historical Parrott gun was the 1st Battery, Company A. It is their story with which we are most concerned. Battery D, also from Coldwater, fought in many of the same campaigns as Battery A. On May 28, 1861, the battery was formally entered into the federal service. There were 125 men with an average age of 23 years. About 50 of the volunteers were from Branch County, 15 from the original pre-war company. They had 6 bronze 6-pounder guns from 1841, which were state-owned pieces. Also about this time, Captain Culp and Lieutenant Youngs resigned, and Loomis became the company's captain. Training was intensified and more structured, and the battery began to take on a more military decorum. When the group left Detroit for Cincinnati, Ohio on June 1st, the unit was probably better trained than most of the volunteer artillery units on either side. It was the first battery to pass through Cincinnati, and a parade was held in order for the Buckeyes to see the guns. Even though they were in a northern state, the border state of Kentucky was just across the river, and sentiments in that area were mixed. For example, a newspaper correspondent from Detroit traveling with the battery noticed an elderly man distributing free tobacco among the men in Cincinnati. Captain Loomis, his suspicion aroused, had the tobacco inspected. It was poisoned, and the old man had disappeared. Further drill was conducted by the battery at Camp Dennison, 17 miles from Cincinnati. The battery underwent extensive training, including getting the horses used to the odor of gunpowder and smoke and the sound of cannon fire. The best gunners were selected as the chief of each piece. In all, it took several men to fire each gun, each with a specific regimented duty. The guns then used by the battery were smoothbore cannons. The company's requisition for rifled guns went without approval. It was these older weapons they took with them as Company A moved along to Marietta, Ohio, and then to Parkersburg in western Virginia. The Michigan men were not expecting pro-Union sentiment in a seceded state, but they found the Virginians were thrilled by the presence of federal troops. While on the march through the town, the men were met by 3 young ladies, one dressed in red, another in white, and a third in blue. They were standing in front of a mammoth U.S. flag.
From that point, the battery entered the actual horrifying theater of war. And to look at the campaigns they were involved in, we only have to cross the street. I'm in the Holbrook Heritage Room at the Branch County Library in Coldwater. This reference room, besides many genealogical references and county histories, has a nice section of Civil War histories. In this volume, we're looking for early actions in Western Virginia.
The battery was then attached to the command of General George B. McClellan. At first, they did no fighting, but spent their time marching and building fortifications.
As the war moved slowly elsewhere, McClellan's command became involved in some of the first battles of the conflict.
McClellan's subordinate, General William S. Rosecrans, engaged the enemy in several actions in western Virginia that summer. At the pivotal Battle of Rich Mountain, the Confederates were flanked, and nearly half of their army surrendered. After a few more small engagements, the rebels were permanently pushed out of western Virginia. Though the A Battery was at the Rich Mountain conflict, it was over before they had a chance to fire their guns.
Compared to later Civil War battles, these early engagements were very small. Less than 4,000 men in all were at Rich Mountain. However, the results were momentous. As the Michigan men had seen, this western part of the rebellious state had strong pro-Union feelings. With the Confederate Army pushed out, this area soon withdrew from the Southern government and later was admitted to the Union as the new state of West Virginia, making it the only territory to secede from both the United States and the Confederate States.
After the West Virginia actions, the battery settled into camp life. For diversions, to waste the time when not drilling, the men played music and sang in choral groups, held debate contests, involved themselves in physical exercise, played baseball, and ate. Among their diet, they ingested bread, rice, corn, fresh beef, coffee, sugar, and salt. Camp life also meant close living conditions and the frequency of diseases. Indeed, more men were lost in the war to disease than to the battlefield. Back home, the women were saying goodbye to their fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons. In many locations, the countryside was almost denuded of adult men. Therefore, women had to carry on the work.
Mary Austin Wallace, the wife of Robert Bruce Wallace of the 19th Michigan Infantry, had to run the family farm near Union City. She had 2 children, and through several months of 1862, she kept a diary. Hear her words about the farm work.
September 20th. I got the pigs out of the corn and drove them home. I hitched up the horses on the wagon, went in the woods, and got me a load of wood. Mr. Harrison come to see about the fence. He went around the lot and said he had fixed it, so he thought the pigs could not get in the corn. He told me if they troubled me again to come and let him know. I finished weeding and hoeing begas and turnips. Ellen Wallace come after some pork. I let her have $1's worth. She said she would endorse it on the note they hold against Bruce. The pigs got in the corn again. I got them out, and Ellen helped me drive them home. I went to Martha's with Ellen to help her carry the pork. I sold Mr. Hitchcock the calf. He said he would work for it and would give me more than a day's work.
While still encamped, the battery received 4 captured Confederate 6-pound guns, which were added to the Michigan pieces. By the end of July, the command, now under General Rosecrans, was rated the #1 Artillery Company. On August 20th, by order of General McClellan, the company received 6 rifled 10-pound Parrott guns.
Not only were the rifled guns more accurate with a longer range than smoothbore weapons, but since the muzzles were made of cast iron instead of bronze, they were cheaper to manufacture. The one here in Veterans Park is stamp number 26. Invented by West Point graduate Robert Parrott, these types of guns are easy to identify. In order to make the barrel withstand the greater pressure required of rifled guns, Parrott devised a wrought iron band which was heat shrunk around the breech, right here. Also, by using limbers, much like the one here in the park, the Parrott guns were easily transported about the battlefield to where they were needed.
Actions against the enemy increased after that. At Elk Ford on September 12th, the Federal artillery, including Battery A, broke up rebel infantry. On October 3rd at the Greenbrier River, Union batteries conducted a 4-hour artillery duel with Confederate batteries. With the longer range of the U.S. guns, the Southern cannon were forced to move their position continually, ultimately retiring from the field altogether. Another lull in the action set in, and in mid-December, the men were ordered to Kentucky. Long spells without action would be a major problem for the men and would continue to be so for the rest of its long history in the field. After the move to the Bluegrass State, there were several reports of complaints by enlisted men concerning favoritism shown by some of the officers. There were reports of drunkenness and other incidents, including complaints about Captain Loomis himself. 2 of the more disciplined officers, Lieutenant Otis Gilliam and Lieutenant George W. Van Pelt, threatened to resign unless matters concerning some of the officers changed. But the petty bickering continued. One story states that several ladies were allowed to ride in the ambulances while the wounded had to ride on top. The investigations that resulted amounted to little more than socializing events. The main resultant point was that the artillery's direct commander, General Ormsby B. Mitchell, liked the battery, and that was that. Early in 1862, General Ulysses S. Grant, with the help of the riverborne U.S. Navy, captured Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, then took Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. This turned the positions of several Confederate outposts, including that of Bowling Green, Kentucky. This was the first great victory of the war, both strategically and tactically. On February 13th, when General Mitchell was ordered to Bowling Green, the local battery went with him. Upon reaching the city, Mitchell found the rebels trying to evacuate arms and stores aboard trains. The Michiganders unlimbered their guns, and a few nicely placed shells from 1.5 miles away disabled an engine, making it impossible for the fleeing enemy to move the 9 trains behind it. Most of the Confederate stores fell into Yankee hands. General Mitchell was delighted with the event and commended Company A on their accuracy and skill. With the Confederate cordon of defense in Kentucky breached by Grant's movements in the West, The Confederates retreated to Nashville, then moved further south when that city became untenable. Mitchell moved south and occupied Nashville, including its major cannon works. While there was a brief respite from major action, the Federal Army was not inactive.
Rebel guerrillas and raiding cavalry harassed the Federal lines of communications, and Union leaders had to use all their wiles and efforts to keep the lines open and repair those which had been cut. John Hunt Morgan, the excellent cavalry leader, raided Union supply lines as far north as the Ohio River. Several men of the Michigan Battery were impressed into the cavalry to campaign against Morgan. After that, the battery found itself back in Nashville with little to do. Thus, they returned to their usual bickering between the enlisted men and the officers. When the Army moved out that summer, the battery was involved in many minor engagements. Most importantly, Mitchell moved to Huntsville, Alabama. Rebel actions continually harassed Union lines of communication, and General Henry W. Halleck, in command of all the Western Union armies, ordered those lines to be opened. With Mitchell's move to Huntsville, he captured virtually intact the Memphis and Charleston Railroad line in the area. For the rest of the summer, Confederate plans were to force the Union armies to pull back. The Union leaders spent their time thwarting those plans and fighting to keep the supply lines open.
Back home, another harvest had come. Mary Wallace wrote to her husband,
October 20th, I went to Coldwater. I got my likeness, Johnny's, and the baby's taken together to send to Bruce.
Early in October, she went to the fair in Coldwater, located on the same grounds where the battery had first mustered at the beginning of the war.
October 8th, my folks and myself went to Coldwater to the fair. Mr. Keyes paid 15 cents for me to go in the tent and see the trick horse. As they all went in, he said he would pay. I might repay him sometime when I get home. Pa borrowed $1 from me.
But the local battery had its own news to write home about in early October. With rebel raiders attacking Federal communications throughout Kentucky and Tennessee, Confederate General Braxton Bragg then launched a major offensive toward Kentucky. The Union commander of the Army of the Ohio, General Don Carlos Buell, then had to decide whether to hold Nashville or perhaps fall back to Louisville in order to protect communications running along the Ohio River.
If he fell back into Kentucky, he would relinquish Middle Tennessee. His decision was to garrison Nashville and pull his major force back to Louisville.
The Michigan Battery was ordered to leave Huntsville and march north to Louisville in September. Washington was worried about the raids toward Cincinnati, so President Lincoln had General Halleck dispatch an aide to order Buell to turn over his command to General George H. Thomas. But the people in the region felt Buell's retreat from Nashville had saved Louisville and Cincinnati, and Thomas refused the command. Buell was left in charge. Buell, prodded into action by Washington, moved forward. Bragg, who was carrying on arguments with his subordinate generals, also moved.
At about the same time Mrs. Wallace was going to the Coldwater Fair, the two armies met at Perryville, Kentucky, in a major battle.
Skirmishing had begun on October 7th. Bragg had hoped for a Napoleonic maneuver of concentrating most of his army at the Federal weak point. But General Leonidas Polk, an Episcopal bishop, retreated from his position rather than advance, and Bragg's hoped-for concentration was foiled. He wanted to relieve the bishop of his command, but Polk was too close to President Jefferson Davis. A drought had dried up all the creeks in the region, and both sides were looking for water on the 7th when they stumbled into each other. Neither side knew exactly what they faced, but Bragg determined to attack the Union left the next day, not knowing he was attacking nearly the entire Union Army of the Ohio. The next day, the Coldwater Battery came down the Mackville Pike with General Lovell Rousseau's 3rd Division. While the rebels made headway against the Union left flank, Confederate General Benjamin F. Cheatham rode forward and yelled, "Give 'em hell, boys!" Just as enthused, but remembering he was a clergyman, General Polk shouted, "Give it to 'em, boys! Give 'em what General Cheatham says!" As they charged across the Chaplin River and up the far bank, they were cut down by a perfect crossfire from several Federal batteries. In the ensuing battle, Federal cannon fire forced the Confederate batteries to retreat from their initial position to a safer area. As the blue-clad army fell back early in the battle to reform its lines, the battery opened up on the rebel line. The attacking Confederate line was halted by the bloody carnage caused by the guns. Shortly thereafter, the battery ran out of ammunition and had to fall back behind the infantry line. With the withdrawal of the battery, the battle began to return in favor of the gray-clad army. Late in the battle, at twilight, Bishop Polk saw a unit firing on his troops and ordered them to cease fire. The colonel in command assured the general he was positive he was firing on the enemy.
The bishop on horseback demanded to know the colonel's name and unit. His surprise must have been great when he discovered it was an Indiana infantry regiment. As soon as possible, Polk withdrew from the scene.
For the numbers involved, the casualties were high. As far as the tactics of the day, Bragg had fared better. But though his generals wanted to continue the fight the next day, their commander knew, being greatly outnumbered without rearward lines of communication, he had to retreat.
Bragg fell back to East Tennessee. Thus the battle was a strategic victory for the North. But in essence, neither side won. In total, the Michigan guns performed very well. They had saved the right wing of Buell's army. If there was a problem with their performance, it was that their enthusiasm led them to expend their ammunition so early in the battle. The guns would have come in useful a couple of hours later in the afternoon when the rebel guns were brought back into the battle and caused many casualties. Accounts differ as to the number of men lost by the Michigan battery. One source says 9, including 1 dead, 7 wounded, and 1 missing. Another account says 18 men plus 30 horses. The smaller figure is probably correct.
For the actions of the battery in that battle, Loomis was raised to colonel, no doubt as a reward for his part in the battle. On the negative side of his promotion, Loomis was rarely again with his battery. Like John Parkhurst, after the war he was brevetted as a general for his service. Capable Lieutenant Van Pelt became the battery commander. However, the results of the Perryville battle were unsatisfactory to both capitals, Washington and Richmond. Neither side gained anything from the conflict other than to add to the growing roll of war casualties. However, the battery then moved forward once again back to Nashville. Bragg moved south to the Chattanooga area. Meanwhile, General Buell was replaced by General Rosecrans, and the name of the army was changed to the Army of the Cumberland. That first large battle must have had an effect on the Branch County gunners. Some of the officers, who were frequently absent, resigned soon after. One of them was Lieutenant R.G. Chandler, the son of Coldwater's mayor, who was listed as absent without leave. Back in Nashville, supply problems continued for the Army, and General Rosecrans, Rosie as he was called by his men, waited until he had everything he needed. Lincoln was impatient at the long delay in Nashville into December. Bragg's army also underwent a name change. It was now called the Army of Tennessee. After the Perryville battle, that army moved from Chattanooga to Tullahoma to the Stones River toward Murfreesboro. Bragg's problems had not changed. He did constant verbal battle with his commanders, Edmund Kirby Smith, William J. Hardy, and Bishop Polk. But the pall over the command bickering was shunted into the background by a glittering social event that December. When the Federals briefly held Murfreesboro that past summer, several Yankees made scathing remarks about the dashing Confederate cavalry general, John Hunt Morgan. A 17-year-old girl by the name of Mattie Reddy, who worshiped the rebel trooper, defended her hero. Asked who she was, she replied,
It's Maddie Ready now, but by the grace of God, one day I hope to call myself the wife of John Morgan.
After the Confederates retook the city, Morgan heard the story and called on Maddie Ready. Finding her as pretty as she was patriotic, he fell in love. Their wedding was attended by the top commanders of the Army of Tennessee, and Bishop General Polk performed the ceremony. By Christmas, Rosie was ready to move on Murfreesboro. After the Army of the Cumberland marched to the area, the Union forces camped to the west of Stones River. The interesting thing in each headquarters that night was the fact both Bragg and Rosecrans had decided on the same tactic: to attack the enemy's right flank. That night, the nervous soldiers on both sides were treated to a battle of the bands. Southern musicians played the Bonnie Blue Flag or Dixie, while Yankee musicians replied with Yankee Doodle or the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Then one band began to play Home Sweet Home, and the musicians on both sides of the river took up the cue. There, the night before a terrific battle, the bands and singing soldiers of both armies were reunited in the one constant that occupied the minds of them all: thinking of home.
After midnight, General Phil Sheridan on the Union right received reports of rebel movements across his front, massing on the flank. The Coldwater Battery was located in reserve with Rousseau's 3rd Division behind the Federal center. Early the next morning, Bragg ordered his attack on the Federal right to begin, with General Hardee launching the first move. The Union right was undermanned, and the Confederate juggernaut hit the flank in overwhelming numbers, and a general rout of the Yankees ensued as General Alexander McCook was driven back. Rosecrans ordered General Thomas to send Rousseau to the rear of Sheridan's hard-pressed position, and he postponed his own attack of the Confederate right. When McCook fell back in headlong retreat, Rousseau ordered his infantry to fall behind his artillery in order to give it a clear field of firing. Firing double canister, the Michigan men and other batteries tore into 4 successive rebel charges, causing fearful casualties. But though their losses were great, the gray-clad assaults broke off more of the Federal right. General Sheridan's right wing was thus exposed, and he had his men move back, making his line perpendicular to where it was located when the battle began. The Union line was now V-shaped. Men from other divisions appeared on the scene to reinforce and extend the battered right wing. However, Rousseau and Sheridan, fighting in the apex of the V, had to fall back further due to a lack of ammunition. This created a gap in the Yankee line. Seeing the gap, General Polk ordered his final 2 brigades to charge the opening. It was a disaster. Caught in a terrible crossfire from Federal artillery and infantry, the 2 brigades lost more than 50% of their men. During the battle, General Rousseau rode up to the Loomis battery and noted a young soldier holding the horses. Cannon shells were hitting all about him, and rather than seeming afraid, he appeared more excited. The general noted the youth began to sing and dance amid the bursting shells.
Rousseau was pleased with the lad's deportment and rode up to him and shouted over the sounds of battle, "Well done, my brave boy. Let me shake hands with you." The officer then returned to his other pressing duties.
Seeing the northern right was strengthened, Bragg convinced himself the Union left must have been weakened. He did not figure, since the blue line was in a V shape, it would be easy for the Yankees to assist any part of the line which was threatened. Bragg ordered General John C. Breckinridge, the former Vice President of the United States, to attack the Federal left. Again, it was a mistake. Union artillery fire decimated the attack, virtually ending the day's battle. That cold, wet evening, Bragg was confident he had defeated the Union Army, and he was certain they would evacuate that night. He sent a message of victory on to Richmond. The next day, New Year's Day, 1863, Bragg was astonished to find Rosecrans still in his lines. An entire day was wasted while the Confederate commander decided what to do. The holiday saw only minor skirmishing, of which the Coldwater men played no part. On January 2nd, Bragg noted Federal artillery had positioned itself on a commanding hill on the Federal left. He ordered General Breckinridge to attack it. The former vice president had scouted the position and knew it was too formidable for a general assault. After arguments with his commander about the foolishness of the endeavor failed, Breckinridge sent in the famous Orphan Brigade of Kentucky, called orphans because their home state was in Union hands. Bragg had previously displayed contempt for the brigade, which had an enviable record. Against the odds, the attack led by the orphans was initially successful. Then, while chasing the fleeing Federals from the hill, the rebels ran into the fire of the massed Yankee cannon, including the Loomis Battery. Great chunks were torn from the gray-clad line. The attack halted, shuddered, then fell back. At that moment, Rosecrans ordered his army to attack. The move was successful. The Yankees charged across the river, and the tide of battle turned. Eventually, seeing the maneuver was not going to work, Bragg ordered a retreat. When General Breckinridge saw how thin the returning ranks were, he cried aloud, "My poor orphans, my poor orphan brigade, they've been cut to pieces." On January 3rd, Bragg conferred with Generals Hardee and Polk, and all agreed they must retreat and leave the field to the Army of the Cumberland. There was minor skirmishing that day as the Confederates fell back to points southward. The Coldwater men supported an infantry attack to clear some nearby woods of rebels, the artillery fire preventing Bragg from sending in reinforcements. In the entire battle, each side lost more than 9,200 men. Rosecrans had lost 23% of his effective fighting force. Bragg lost 27%.
As for the Loomis Battery, it suffered 1 dead and 11 seriously wounded. 2 later died. One who had a rebel shell hit the gun he was aiming, and another who lost both hands when his own gun fired while he was ramming a charge down the barrel. Another source states the unit had 22 casualties, along with 40 horses. For their efforts, the battery was highly praised, and the infantry began to feel a kinship toward the Loomis Battery, which had supported them so well.
The main outcome of the year-end conflict was that Kentucky was now saved for the Union. The next stop was to move after Bragg and try to take the great Confederate rail center of Chattanooga. A few days after the battle, General Rousseau visited the battery's camp. He told the story of the dancing soldier at Stone's River to Captain Van Pelt and said he wanted to see the youth again. Private James McCarty was ordered front and center from the ranks. He stepped forward, blushing deeply.
The general commended his conduct and then said for all to hear, "I shook hands with you on the battlefield, and I now wish to do it once again in the presence of your brother soldiers. May you carry the same spirit through the war and come out safely at last, as you are sure to come out honorably." Thereupon, Rousseau shook McCarty's hand a second time. For the rest of the winter, through spring and into the summer, the Army was relatively inactive. Rosecrans sat at Murfreesboro, and Bragg stayed put about 30 miles away at Tullahoma. Both Richmond and Washington were irate over the inactivity of their armies and the procrastination of their commanding generals. The federal government felt the Army of the Cumberland should march toward its goal, the city of Chattanooga. It was a major railroad center, plus the Tennessee River was a strategic point in the logistics of the area. President Lincoln wanted Rosecrans to move before Bragg was reinforced, or worse still, before Bragg could send any troops westward, where by June, Union General Grant was besieging Vicksburg, Mississippi. The Loomis Battery was now attached to General Absalom Baird's division of General Thomas's 14th Corps, and it was with that corps the Coldwater Battery finally marched out on June 24th. To hinder the operation, it rained for 17 straight days.
Mary Van Pelt, who had earlier joined her husband, had to stay behind while the Army marched. As the Army of the Cumberland moved deeper into Tennessee, she cared for the sick and wounded in hospitals at Nashville and Murfreesboro. The campaign was such a brilliant strategic maneuver that tactical operations on the battlefield were practically non-existent. With very few engagements, Rosecrans skillfully turned Bragg's flank and forced the Confederates out of Tullahoma and back to Chattanooga. Rosie entered Tullahoma on July 3rd. On that same day, at Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee launched his final attack against the Army of the Potomac and failed. The North had won the biggest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. The next day, the 4th of July, rebel forces in Vicksburg surrendered to General Grant, closing the Mississippi River to the Confederate States. 3 tremendous victories in the span of 2 days set off excited celebrations throughout the North, while the South mourned the loss of so many of its boys and wondered about the leadership which had led its arms to such catastrophic defeats. However, Rosecrans became upset when Halleck, now General-in-Chief in Washington, asked if Rosecrans would be willing to take the chance of defeating the enemy, as Union arms had done at Vicksburg and Gettysburg. Rosecrans was acrimonious. Angrily, he wired back that his Army of the Cumberland had driven the enemy from Middle Tennessee, but he feared those in the War Department were overlooking the Army's great achievement. Because, in Rosecrans' words, it is not written in letters of blood. As if he had accomplished nothing, Halleck and the War Department ordered Rosie to hit the marching trail after Bragg. And, as usual, Rosecrans would not move until he was confident everything was in order. Knowing the rebels would be raiding his long line of communications back to Nashville, he wanted to make repairs on the line before moving on Chattanooga. About that time, Mrs. Van Pelt rejoined her husband. For Rosecrans' big push, he had Grant's Army of the Tennessee protecting his right flank far to the west. In order to secure the left flank to the east, General Ambrose Burnside, a former commander of the Army of the Potomac, was ordered by Washington to move with his small Army of the Ohio to take Knoxville. Finally, Rosecrans moved. On the march, General Thomas noticed Mrs. Van Pelt with her husband. Seeing Colonel Parkhurst of the 9th Michigan nearby, he asked the Coldwater man who the woman was. Parkhurst identified her and stated that she was always with her husband and that she looked after the wounded. He told Thomas she had been available at nearly every engagement. Thomas seemed impressed, but when rifle fire was heard in the distance, he said, "Colonel, give him my compliments and tell him his wife must get to the rear." Mrs. Van Pelt was ushered back toward Tullahoma. As he neared Chattanooga, Rosecrans sent one small detachment of his army to the north bank of the Tennessee River above the city to make a feint. Bragg took the bait. Figuring a Union attack was going to come from the north of the city, he made preparations in that direction. Meanwhile, in another nearly bloodless campaign, Rosecrans moved almost his entire army to the west and south of the city in an attempt to cut the Confederate communications. The local battery had one sharp engagement at Hoover's Gap, then crossed the Tennessee River at Bridgeport, Alabama. They later marched to Raccoon Mountain and into Lookout Valley. As with the Tullahoma campaign, Bragg was forced to retreat before a major action took place. He abandoned Chattanooga and fell back. Elated over this second great turning movement, Rosecrans separated his 3 corps in order to get a wide dispersal in his pursuit of Braxton Bragg. General Thomas, noting increased rebel activity and pockets of resistance during the chase, informed Rosecrans he did not think it wise to have the army separated.
But Rosecrans thought the Confederate leader was in full retreat. Not only was Bragg not in retreat, he was regrouping his reinforced corps.
Bragg's new corps were now led by Bishop Polk, Simon Bolivar Buckner, William H.T. Walker, and Daniel Harvey Hill, who had replaced General Hardee. While the Union Army probed for the retreating rebels, Bragg made several efforts in the next few days to catch the Union Army while it was separated. However, through the errors of his corps commanders and his own vague orders, he was unsuccessful. The only luck he had was that Rosecrans refused to believe the Southern Army was in force and standing fast south of Chattanooga. Rosecrans' only luck was that none of Bragg's plans for a surprise had worked, and the Yankee general was able to concentrate most of his army southeast of the city with Missionary Ridge at its back.
In order to help the South stem its long list of summer defeats, Richmond took Lee's best corps commander, General James Longstreet, from the Virginia theater and by train move it along to reinforce Bragg. Unable to use the regular rail lines, which would have got the Army there quickly, they had to take a rather circuitous route through the Carolinas. But the leading elements of that army under General John Bell Hood were in place before the Battle of Chickamauga began. The night before the battle, both commanders knew the enemy was at hand, but neither knew exactly the dispositions of the other. The Coldwater Battery was located on the Union left at the Lafayette and Chattanooga Road. Their immediate commander on the field was the 1st Brigade Commander, Colonel Benjamin F. Scribner of the 38th Indiana Infantry.
I'm standing near the Lafayette Road where the battery was situated. This is the Chickamauga Battlefield, a part of the Chattanooga-Chickamauga National Military Park. With me is John Sissel, Chief Ranger at the park.
The Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park is the oldest and largest national military park in the country. It consists of 3 basic units. The Chickamauga Battlefield is the largest unit, 5,300 acres. The Lookout Mountain unit is just over 2,000 acres. And then we have various little reservations scattered all along Missionary Ridge. Those are the 3 primary units of the park. They do straddle the Georgia and Tennessee line. The Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park is under the direct administration of the U.S. Department of the Interior National Park Service. There are approximately 350 different national park areas operated by the National Park Service all across the country. This year, 1990, in August, we will celebrate the 100th anniversary of this park. The park was established on August 19th, 1890, for the purpose of suitably marking and preserving for professional military study and for historical study the fields of some of the most remarkable maneuvers of the American Civil War. The park is here today pretty much in the same state as it was at the time of the battle. The Park Service goes to great pains to be sure to maintain the fields and the wood lines and so forth in approximately the same shape as they were at the time of the battle.
On the morning of September 19, 1863, Federal cavalry attacked General Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry on the Confederate right and pushed it back, starting the battle. General Walker of Polk's wing on the rebel right attacked the Union left. At first, the contest rolled back and forth, but the gray-clad army made headway when Walker sent in the regiments of General St. John Liddell, whose attack headed straight for the Michigan guns.
They came from that direction.
Greatly outnumbered, General Baird's Federal infantry fell back, exposing the flank of Battery A. The rough ground and woodland made it difficult for the guns to be moved as fast as the infantry, but 2 Indiana infantry companies tried to support the artillery. Van Pelt was able to fire 64 rounds of canister into the charging mass, but the attack was coming from 2 sides, and soon it was obvious the position was going to be overrun. Most of the infantry and gunners fell back as ordered, but Van Pelt refused to leave the guns. He remained in position with 5 other men as Liddell's infantry charged into them. Van Pelt, sword in hand, ordered the enemy to keep its hands off the guns, but in moments, he and the others were shot down. 5 of the 6 guns were captured. This is from the official report turned in by General Liddell concerning this segment of the Battle of Chickamauga.
In a few minutes, we became hotly engaged with the enemy's infantry and their artillery, and pressing forward with a shout, we captured all the artillery in our immediate front with many prisoners. And I ordered the artillery to be taken to the rear as rapidly as possible. But so many horses had been killed that it was difficult to secure the pieces.
From the other side of the line, General Baird's report stated,
4 pieces of Colonel Scribner's battery were captured after firing 64 rounds, and the enemy, sweeping like a torrent, fell upon the regular brigade before it got into position and took its battery.
The Yankee commander on the spot, Colonel Scribner, said in his official report that after fighting off an advance on the left, the direction in which the guns were facing, he was informed the right flank was being turned.
Suddenly, everything was in chaos, and he continued,
Then, contending with an overwhelming force in my front and on my flank, was fought one of the most stubborn and heroic fights that ever fell into my lot to witness. The gallant Lieutenant Van Pelt was shot down at his guns, having fired 64 rounds into the midst of the enemy as they came charging down the hill. The 2 regiments on the right and left of the battery at the same time pouring in a well-directed fire.
Though it seems the participants do not agree on the number of the 6 Parrots taken, the final result was 5 of the guns passing over to the Confederates. Though the numbers vary, the highest account has 35 men of the battery killed, wounded, or captured, plus 46 horses dead.
which explains why General Liddell found it so hard to remove the guns to the rebel rear lines, and General Rousseau's wish for the safety of Private James McCarty, with whom he shook hands at Stone's River, went unheeded. McCarty was killed in the action. Only 1 team of horses remained, including Old Sam, one of the original horses from Coldwater. 1 gun remained on the field, and members of the battery who made it to safety used the remaining horses and went back into the raging battle to haul the Parrot to safety. Later that day, another of the guns was recovered.
However, Battery A of the 1st Michigan Light Artillery was decimated. Its ranks shot to pieces, nearly all of its horses dead, and most of its guns in the hands of its brave enemy.
Here is the monument of the Loomis Battery on the spot of the field where George Van Pelt fell. The state of Michigan, as with all other states, created funding for the erection of monuments on many of the battlefields. There are many monuments dedicated to Michigan units here at Chickamauga. Here is the monument dedicated to the 9th Michigan Infantry. At one time it held the likeness of Colonel Parkhurst, but sometime in the past 30 years that likeness was destroyed by vandals.
.666 monuments, 750 cast iron tablets, and over 255 artillery pieces mark the locations of where the heaviest fighting occurred in the battles of Chickamauga and later, of course, the battles of Chattanooga. We are in the process at this time of working on a route for a bypass around the park, which will take the heavy traffic out of the center of the park, creating a much more park-like atmosphere on the interior of the park. Monuments like the Parkhurst Monument will be moved slightly. As a point of interest, it also might be pointed out that the Parkhurst, even though his unit was engaged heavily during the two-day battle, his greatest perhaps contribution to the Union effort here was at McFarland Gap. Initially, the monument that you see here was intended to be outside the park in the McFarland Gap of Missionary Ridge, but for protection of the monument it was moved back into the park. So these monuments, the ones that are located right here on the boundary, were from units that did see heavy action outside of what is now the National Military Park.
Lieutenant Colonel Melvin Mudge of Quincy commanded the 11th Michigan Infantry, to whom this monument is dedicated. And there are others, here and across the great battlefields of this war. I'm here at Confederama in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where they have a wonderful diorama of both the Battle of Chickamauga and the Battle of Chattanooga.
On that September day in 1863, as the battle moved back and forth, the outnumbered Union troops were forced to change positions frequently. General Rosecrans then switched his headquarters to the house owned by Eliza Glenn, a widow. Soldiers from both sides stated the fighting and firing was so loud, men could not hear the shouts of their comrades 10 feet away. Meanwhile, across the Union right flank, Longstreet's subordinate commander, John Bell Hood, had not received orders. Finally, he attacked on his own initiative at about 4 p.m. His regiments, dressed in new light blue uniforms, did well in pushing back the Yankees until they were met by a terrific Union artillery barrage. However, before the attack stalled, they had pushed back the Union center. The last attack against the Union position that day was by talented General Patrick Cleburne. His men gained a mile before they were halted by the Northerners, and it became too dark to see. His men then sat right where they were for the night, in the forest, among the dead and wounded. The battle had gone well for the Confederate arms, but they were still dismayed at the stubborn resistance of the Army of the Cumberland. General Longstreet arrived that evening, and Bragg formed his army into two wings, Polk on the right and Longstreet on the left. Bragg's plan was to hit the Yankee left again. In the Union headquarters at the Widow Glenn's house, Rosecrans and his generals decided to take a defensive posture for the next day's carnage. General Thomas slept in a chair, but when his opinion was solicited, he would say, "I'd strengthen the left," then return to his slumber.
For the soldiers, it was a miserable night. Occasional infantry and cannon fire made it hard to rest peacefully. Plus, the area between the two lines was filled with the cries of agony of wounded and dying men. The summer drought was still in effect, and as the Confederates held Chickamauga Creek, the Northern troops were unable to quench their thirst.
The next day, September 20th, Bragg's attack got started late. But shortly before 10 a.m., Bishop Polk sent in General Breckinridge against the Union left. One of the officers of the Orphan Brigade was Benjamin Helm, a brother-in-law of First Lady Mary Lincoln. He was mortally wounded during the first attack. During the early part of the battle, Rosecrans gave General Thomas Wood a hard dressing down for not moving his troops into line. That scene would play an important part in the events which followed. The Confederates launched attack after attack, some of which gained ground, others that failed, and all were bloody. By this time, General Thomas was continually sending messages to headquarters for reinforcements. One of his staff officers, riding along the line, noticed a gap in the Federal dispositions between the divisions of General Wood and General John Reynolds. He reported this to Thomas, and the message was sent along to Rosecrans. Worried about the gap, Rosie ordered General Wood to close up his division on General Reynolds.
Wood was confused. He knew no gap existed. The staff officer had missed a Union division back among those trees. Though he was confused, he did not wish to receive another loud rebuke from Rosecrans.
So he followed orders and moved to his left. Other units being sent to the north to reinforce Thomas also moved to the left. It was the tremendous luck of the rebels and the deadly misfortune of the Yankees that at that moment General Longstreet was preparing to attack that part of the field. Though no gap had existed before, there was now a widening gap in the Union line. And when 23,000 Confederates attacked
Right here at the Brotherton House, the Union line was broken and the right flank panicked. General Hood, already suffering an arm wound he received in the Battle of Gettysburg, was hit in the leg and taken to the rear. The leg was later amputated.
with the Union line cut in two, the retreat of the right flank became a rout. The rout became a stampede. Half of the Federal line disintegrated as the Yankee mob threw down weapons and equipment and generally herded itself back toward Rossville and Chattanooga. The only effective fighting force left on the field for the Yankees was that of General Thomas. Rosecrans was swept away by the maddened mob. He ordered General James Garfield, the future 20th president, to go to Chattanooga and organize a defense. Garfield stated it would be more effective if Rosecrans went to Chattanooga himself. The commander agreed, and Garfield started on his way to Thomas's headquarters. Once back in the city, Rosecrans sat with his head in his hands in complete despair.
Still holding out, General Thomas didn't realize what had happened on his right. He organized a line of defense here on Snodgrass Hill and on the adjacent high ground called Horseshoe Ridge. He continued to search for General Sheridan's division, which was supposed to reinforce him. He didn't know it was streaming in retreat.
Soon, the general noticed blue-clad soldiers coming toward him. However, these turned out to be Longstreet's men. Finished with their job on the Union right, they had turned north to hit Thomas in the flank. Thomas's initial elation turned to dismay.
However, the defense here on Snodgrass Hill, along with the resolution of Thomas, was working.
The Confederates sent in wave after wave of attacking divisions, which wilted away under the defensive fire of the Federals. Holding out alone, Thomas's next problem was that his army was running out of ammunition. Federal soldiers were scrambling about, taking the cartridges from the dead.
With all hope gone, Thomas and his staff noticed more blue-clad troops coming in from the north. They were not certain if they were friend or foe. Thomas's horse jittered about, making it impossible for the general to get a steady view through his field glass. He handed it to a staff officer to see what force was coming toward them.
For the first time that day, luck was with the Yankees. 3 brigades under General John B. Steedman of General Gordon Granger's Reserve Corps had been positioned far to the north. Steedman had received no orders all day from Rosecrans. Finally, he acted on his own and reinforced the hard-pressed Union line. By now, Thomas was fighting every single Confederate brigade, but still he held. In fact, General Longstreet stated he launched 25 attacks with just his portion of the army. Soon General Garfield arrived on the scene and informed the battling commander of the fate of the Federal right wing. Thomas stated flatly that the position now occupied by his army must be held until night. Garfield sent a message back to Rosecrans stating Thomas was standing like a rock. The term stuck, and from that day on, George H. Thomas has been known to history by the sobriquet of the Rock of Chickamauga. When darkness began to fall, the Federal line began an orderly retreat while fighting at the same time. Soon, only 3 regiments, including the 22nd Michigan, were left on the field to cover the retreat.
Out of ammunition, in order to protect the retreat as much as possible, the regiments launched a bayonet attack. After making good progress, they were overwhelmed.
It had been a brilliant retreat under fire in the face of the enemy.
Longstreet, Polk, and Bedford Forrest were ready to take up the chase. The bishop told Bragg that Rosie could be destroyed at Rossville or before the Yankees could build proper defenses at Chattanooga.
But Bragg refused to believe he had won.
A rebel soldier was found who had been captured and escaped. He stated he had seen the Yankees in their panic. Bragg asked, "Do you know what a retreat looks like?" The soldier responded, "I ought to, General. I've been with you during your whole campaign."
Later, Forrest and Bragg got into an argument over the South's failure to closely pursue the defeated Federal Army. Thus, Rosecrans' army made it safely back to Chattanooga, shattered and defeated, but intact. They began to build fortifications to meet the expected attack from Bragg. It had been the bloodiest 2-day battle of the war. The Union Army lost just over 16,000 men, killed, wounded, captured, and missing. The Confederate Army lost almost 18,500.
In essence, for the Coldwater Battery mates, the war was all but over. Their unit was destroyed, and as the Union Army took refuge in the city, the men from Branch County could only feel remorse for the comrades they had left on the field of Chickamauga. Finally, the Confederate Army followed the Union troopers to Chattanooga. From here on Lookout Mountain, you can see the problems which faced the Northern Army.
In 1863, the city of Chattanooga was much smaller, of course, about a population of 3,500.
It was tucked into that bend of the Tennessee River. Though the rebel army did not surround the city, Rosecrans, in fact, was under siege. Bragg's main position was there, along Missionary Ridge. He also had a position up here on Lookout Mountain.
The Yankee supply line was to the southwest at Bridgeport, and in order to get supplies, boats or wagons would have to pass under the guns of Lookout. And to add to the logistical problems, the roads and passes to the north of the river were impossible for overland supplies. In many places, the roads were nothing more than mere footpaths. The trail was rocky and crooked, and rebel raiders lurked about to make sure nothing got into Chattanooga.
The troops in the city had to view the terrible specter of Lookout Mountain looming over the area. The old supply route to the town normally took a matter of hours. Because of the Confederate dispositions, the new route usually took more than 2 weeks. The route was extremely hard on the horses and mules, and many died along the way. At headquarters, Rosecrans did not seem to be of a sound mind or a capacity to lead.
President Lincoln, reading the general's odd assortment of messages, stated the commander of the Army of the Cumberland seemed as though he was stunned like a duck hit on the head. The soldiers and civilians began to suffer. While the draft animals died, occupants of the city would carve them up for food. The population had worse problems. The Army tore down the houses in order to use the wood for fires. There was no food for the animals, and that fall, 10,000 horses and mules died. In order to get aid to the beleaguered city, Halleck ordered a former commander of the Army of the Potomac, General Joseph Hooker, westward from Virginia with 2 corps. The relief made the distance to the supply base at Bridgeport very quickly, but there was little they could do from there. Even if they could have made it to Chattanooga, their 20,000 men would have been added to the already starving troops. Also, General William Tecumseh Sherman was ordered from Vicksburg to move eastward. However, he made little headway because Halleck ordered him to repair the Memphis and Charleston Railroad as he went.
If matters for the Federals were mostly logistical, they bordered on rebellion at Confederate headquarters.
Bragg began to make excuses and find blame for allowing the Yankees to escape from Chickamauga. First, he sacked General Thomas Hindman and relieved General Polk and sent him to Atlanta.
Then, in order to make sure the Union supply line was destroyed, he ordered Forrest to turn over his cavalry command to Joseph Wheeler.
Forrest was furious. Storming the headquarters, the excellent cavalry commander called Bragg a coward, a scoundrel, said he was contemptible, a liar, and threatened his life.
Instead of meeting with a harsh punishment for being insubordinate to his commander, he was transferred by President Davis. However, Wheeler kept Forrest's troopers.
Wheeler then did a credible job attacking the meager Union supply lines. Overall, hundreds of wagons and prisoners were taken, and 1,000 mules were destroyed.
But it was a Pyrrhic victory. When Wheeler returned to his base, he had lost 700 men. Forrest's fine command had been ruined. Rebel commanders then decided to have Bragg removed and petitioned President Davis to that fact.
Davis took the train for Chattanooga. When he arrived, the rebel troops took heart.
But his trip gained little, especially as the command of the Army was concerned. Bragg remained at his post.
D.H. Hill was suspended and sent home, while General Breckinridge took over Hill's command.
But there was little Bragg could do with General Longstreet, who was one of the most respected generals in the Confederate Army. On the surface, as late autumn arrived, it seemed no one liked General Bragg except Jefferson Davis.
While the commands of both armies seemed to be lost in bickering and indecision, a man from the West was on his way to Chattanooga.
Here was a man who not only could make decisions, he was endowed with grim determination and had a resume that included a long string of great victories.
In Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant received a message from General Halleck in Washington to travel to Cairo, Illinois. Once there, he was to wire Washington for further instructions.
It was an odd correspondence, but Grant followed orders.
In Cairo, the mystery continued when he was ordered to Louisville. In that Kentucky city, Grant was met by none other than the Secretary of War himself, Edwin Stanton.
When they met, Stanton walked up to the staff surgeon, an elderly, bearded man, extended his hand saying, "How are you, General Grant? I knew you would cite from your pictures."
Directed to the real General Grant, Stanton told him he was now the commander of the new military division of the Mississippi, giving him command of all the armies between the Mississippi River and the Allegheny Mountains. Grant was given an option. 2 documents were offered to him from which he was to choose. One left the command structure of the Army of the Cumberland as it was. The other replaced Rosecrans with the Rock of Chickamauga. Grant chose Thomas.
On his way to the besieged city, Grant wired the new commander, "Hold Chattanooga at all hazards." Thomas replied, "We will hold the town till we starve."
As he neared the area, Grant met Rosecrans. The relieved general gave Grant a clear picture of the situation in the city and offered some excellent suggestions. Grant said, "My only wonder was that he had not carried them out."
By that time, the Confederates made a terrible error. Unable to relieve Longstreet, Bragg carried out a scheme proposed by President Davis.
Longstreet was ordered to march to Knoxville and destroy the small Army of the Ohio under General Burnside. Feeling the Union situation was hopeless,
Bragg had thus reduced his force before the city and sent away some of his best troops under one of the best corps commanders of the Confederacy.
Arriving in Chattanooga, Grant sized up the situation quickly. He knew the first order of business was to secure better supply lines. Enthusiastic about a plan preferred by General William Smith, Grant slipped a portion of Thomas's troops past Confederate lookouts. Some went by land to the west. Others in pontoon boats sneaked past outposts in the night. The point they sought was Brown's Ferry, over there, west of the city. After a hard but quick fight, the troops held the bridgehead until more reinforcements arrived. Hooker now marched up with supplies, and the siege was broken both in tactics and in reality. The soldiers in Chattanooga had dubbed the supply line the Cracker Line, after the hard crackers they consumed. With the Cracker Line in open, Grant ordered Sherman to suspend operations on the Memphis and Charleston Railroad and proceed with all possible speed to the city. His plan now was to break the rebel defenses about Chattanooga.
During the days before the climactic battle, the troops on both sides spent much time fraternizing.
They exchanged tobacco and foodstuffs and began to know each other personally. Even Grant had his own encounter. While watering his horse, he came upon a blue-clad picket.
Grant asked the youth the name of his regiment, and to his astonishment found out he was from one of Longstreet's regiments. After some polite but meaningless conversation, Grant turned his horse and left the area.
To end the campaign, Grant's plan was for General Hooker to command his right flank and take Lookout Mountain. General Thomas was to remain in the center and keep the attention of the main rebel force on Missionary Ridge, while Sherman was to secretly march behind the city to the north and move to the left flank and take Missionary Ridge from its northern point at Tunnel Hill. Sherman's footsore troops, after the long march, sneaked to their positions and prepared for the assault across the Chattanooga River. The engagement began on November 22nd, when Thomas's troops attacked the advanced rebel outpost at Orchard Knob between Missionary Ridge and Chattanooga.
All the armies in the area could see the action. The Confederates thought the Union troops were going on parade. Then, at a cannon signal, they charged the knob, chasing the gray-clad troops back to the base of the ridge. Grant moved his headquarters to Orchard Knob. The next day, November 23rd, Sherman attacked the area of Missionary Ridge. His march to the ridge had been done in expert fashion. But when he thought his Army of the Tennessee was in position, he discovered they were not at Tunnel Hill at the northern end of the heights. Instead, they were at another hill further to the north, and a small valley lay between the Army and its destination.
While the Confederates under General Cleburne held off Sherman and gave him a fairly good drubbing, Hooker on the Union right advanced against Lookout Mountain. The mist on the mountain was so great, neither side could see much. In a confused and disjointed fight, Hooker's troops pushed up the ridge. Seeing their flank turned, the rebels evacuated the hill, and soon cheers went up all along the Union line as U.S. flags were seen going up on Lookout Mountain. The ominous presence of the height was no longer an element of doom. Now, Grant could open even better supply routes. In order to aid Sherman's attack on November 25th, he planned to have Thomas's Army of the Cumberland take the rebel rifle pits at the base of the ridge. Thomas's army had chafed at Grant's obvious disdain of their fighting power, and they wanted to account themselves well. The battle near Tunnel Hill to the north was going much as the day before, with Cleburne's troops holding Sherman at bay. Also on the Federal right, Hooker was having problems moving through Lookout Valley and toward the ridge. The battle raged into the late afternoon. At that point, in order to relieve pressure on Sherman, Grant ordered Thomas to send in his troops and take the rebel rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge and hold that position. Throughout the all-day fight, the Army of the Cumberland had remained inactive. At the top, General Breckinridge defended the long line of the ridge with but 3 divisions. Bragg had ordered the men at the base of the height to fire 1 volley if attacked, then fall back to the next line. But one error was to loom over everything else. The Confederate guns were situated at the top of the ridge, or the geographic crest. In order to have a clear field of fire and completely cover the slope, they should have been located a short ways down the ridge at the tactical or military crest. That order, added to the location of the cannon, were to prove disastrous. Again, Thomas's men formed ranks as if going on parade. At the signal, they charged across the open ground toward the rifle pits. Both Union and Confederate guns banged forth. The 2 Coldwater guns were among those used, located at the railroad between the town and the ridge. As ordered, the Confederate infantry at the base of the hill fired 1 volley and fell back. This action was read incorrectly by both the Union and Confederate soldiers with different results. The Yankees thought the rebels were retreating, and they gained courage. On the ridge, the Confederate troops also thought they were retreating, and they lost heart. After gaining their objective at the base of the ridge, the Union attackers caught their breath. They also recaptured another of the Loomis battery guns. Realizing the rebel cannon could reach their position without orders, they began to charge up the hill. The entire Union command was caught in shocked surprise. General Grant was beside himself with anger and demanded to know who issued orders for the suicidal attack. Both Generals Granger and Thomas assured him they had given no such orders. All the commanders could do was watch from Orchard Knob.
I'm at the studio of Q1 Video Network in Coldwater. This is our director's personal copy of a first edition printing of Grant's memoirs. Beautiful old volumes. This is what General Grant said about the spontaneous attack. I watched their progress with intense interest. The fire along the rebel line was terrific.
Cannon and musket balls filled the air, but the damage done was in small proportion to the ammunition expended. The pursuit continued until the crest was reached, and soon our men were seen climbing over the Confederate batteries at different points in front of both Sheridan's and Wood's divisions. The retreat of the enemy along most of his line was precipitate, and panic was so great that Bragg and his officers lost all control over their men. Many were captured.
At the base of the ridge, General Sheridan was certain he had misunderstood the orders and figured the men were supposed to take the second line of rifle pits. As he watched his men climb the height, he procured a flask, took a drink, and held the vessel high to salute the rebels above. They responded by firing a round so near him that he was covered with Tennessee dirt. Little Phil, as his men called him, vowed to take those very guns. The undergrowth on the slope of the ridge was much more dense than it now is. The climb up the ridge was tough. Each man carried much equipment. They had to scramble on their hands and knees, grabbing vines and branches as they went. But they discovered the higher they climbed, the safer they were from the enemy's artillery. Conversely, the Confederates discovered they could not train their cannon onto the side of the ridge, making the big guns useless. To add to their fears, the Union troops continued to climb nearer, while the rebels on the slopes were either killed or captured. Those who made it to the top did not stop, but continued to flee to the rear. Some of the Confederates thought the Yankees were drunk. The battle now had been raging all day. A little before dusk, General Hooker on the Union right began to push back the enemy in his front under General Breckinridge. After gaining much ground, the Federals stopped at the base of the ridge. General Bragg thought his army had finally held off the entire Union attack, and he saluted his men.
At that very moment, he noticed most of the center of his line break in panic and begin fleeing to the rear. Bragg saw scores of Union troops come over the ridge, then more, and more still. Now it was the rebels' turn to panic, and they showed they were just as good a fleeing rabble as the Yankees had been at Chickamauga. Moments later, 60 Union regimental flags were seen floating here at the top of Missionary Ridge. All along the Union lines, clear back to Orchard Knob and the town, the Union soldiers were elated.
One of the flags was carried to the top by Lieutenant Arthur MacArthur, Jr. of the 24th Wisconsin. 3 of his regimental color bearers had been shot down, and he scooped up the colors himself and carried them to the top. He was later awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. His son was General Douglas MacArthur. Phil Sheridan was found sitting on one of the guns he had vowed to take. Another officer tried the same maneuver, but as quickly as he leaped atop the cannon, he leaped off again, having burnt his rear end.
Those Confederates who continued to fight were soon flanked by those Yankees who continued to fight. Most were lost in elation and the celebration of the moment. Indeed, on the Confederate right, General Cleburne's men still held Sherman at bay and figured they were winning the battle.
General Hardee rode up to Cleburne and informed him the rest of the army ceased to exist on the ridge.
At that point, Cleburne's men effected an orderly retreat before they could be surrounded. As the rebels made their way back to Chickamauga Station, they were generally a disorganized mob.
General Bragg was as distraught as Rosecrans had been after Chickamauga. Grant then had his army pursue the enemy until November 28th. Before launching another campaign, he wanted to secure his supply lines. Also, he sent Sherman to Knoxville to relieve Burnside. The Army of the Ohio was believed to be starving, but when Sherman arrived, he found the conditions not so tenuous. After having his attacks on Burnside beaten off, Longstreet learned of Sherman's approach and broke off the siege and retreated. For such a major battle, the Chattanooga engagements had very few casualties. In the 3 days of fighting, the Union lost 5,800 men. Bragg lost 6,700, of whom 4,100 were captured and made prisoners of war. The Chattanooga campaigns were over, and the Confederacy was decisively defeated. The way was now open for moving deep into the heart of the South, to Atlanta. Sherman would lead the Western Army, Grant's old command. After taking that city the next year, he would begin his march to the sea. General Thomas also would be in the Atlanta campaign. He then would march back to Nashville and destroy the remnants of the rebel army of Tennessee outside that city.
As for General Grant, he would be promoted to Lieutenant General in command of all the Union armies, a promotion which would take him into direct conflict with Robert E. Lee and the conclusion of the war. But there was still much fighting ahead. As for the Loomis Battery, 2 more of its guns were recaptured on Missionary Ridge, meaning 5 of 6 were back in control of the Coldwater Battery. But as an effective fighting force, its days were over. With the best leaders gone, efforts to reorganize the command for field duty were a failure. The battery was assigned garrison duty at Chattanooga under the command of Francis Edward Hale. Reports were filed stating he was frequently intoxicated. One such report states, Captain Hale, drunk and unfit to transact business. Hale himself signed the report with a shaky hand, covering the page with messy ink blotches. The same type of reports continued into 1864, always with Hale signing them. One said, drunk. Prospect is that he will remain so for some time. It is not known when he resigned, but by November of that year, he is no longer listed. No earlier reports of his drinking exist. Could mean that he was a victim of battle fatigue and was emotionally scarred by the horrors of that final Chattanooga campaign, and it ruined him. This leadership crisis kept the battery in garrison duty on Cameron Hill in the town. Later, when Sherman took Atlanta, the final missing gun was recaptured. Except for one small detail to Dalton, Georgia, the Loomis guns saw no further action for the remainder of the war. In January of 1864, 22 of the battery mates re-enlisted. But when the initial 3-year enlistment expired, 49 of the veterans returned to Michigan in June. Among them
was Old Sam, the last horse from the original complement. It was said that when the horse got off the train in Coldwater and was let loose, he trotted back to his old stable. At any event, the veteran war horse went back into the delivery business and was considered a hero in the county. He is believed to be buried near the graves of many of the Loomis veterans. In 1865, after the war ended, the rest of the battery returned to Michigan and was mustered out of the service on July 28th in Jackson.
The Parrott guns were returned to their states, and a few years later, this gun was given to Coldwater. For many years, it was fired early in the morning on the second Wednesday of each May, signifying the start of another Loomis Battery reunion.
To talk about the latter years of the veterans, we'll look at some of the artifacts in Coldwater here in the Winghouse Museum. The community was proud of the service its men gave during the Civil War. Many reunions for the various units were held long afterward. Here's a photo of the Loomis Battery, obviously not too long after the war, if the age of the veterans is any measure. Here is a pay voucher of the battery signed by Loomis showing how much the men made. And this is an artillery drill book owned by Loomis and signed by him. I'm standing in the dining room with one of the firearms of the battery. I'm here because an odd event took place in this room during one of the reunions. Mrs. Wing, who some say was rather eccentric, allowed veterans to hold a reunion in this very room one spring. Sand and other non-flammable debris were put on the floor, and a campfire was set up for the men. Reunions of local Civil War veterans from the county continued in the county at least up to 1932.
All around me are the graves of the Loomis Battery veterans in Oak Grove Cemetery. In 1931, A.R. Grove, age 93, died, and the newspaper carried the story. He was thought to be the last of the battery. A couple years later, Isaac Lawrence showed up in Coldwater looking to see if any of his battery mates were still around. He was the final member of the battery. When he died on May 3rd, 1938, at the age of 95, the long history of the Loomis Battery came to a close. But that was living history. Actual history never dies. We see it everywhere, in history books, in documentaries.
It's here in this old Parrott gun, or across the street on the library lawn in the statue erected by the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the biggest Civil War veterans organization. The meaning of these statues and artifacts is that the community should never forget the great sacrifices made by its veterans in the war. What they did for us cannot be measured. The prayer is for no more wars. But when the final veteran of the final war dies, it is our duty to remember them all. Democracy is not a birthright. If history proves anything, it gives evidence that freedom is something you have to fight for. And having won it, it must be defended. For there are always powers that will try to take it away. It is to the veterans of all communities and from all wars that we dedicate this work. The greatest story behind any just cause is the living truth of those who surrendered their innocence, gave up their youth, and in many cases, their lives, to make their cause a reality.
This old gun is just one of the monuments to that sacrifice.
Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah. We'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer, the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home.